All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and our first guest on the show today is retired Lieutenant General Robert G. Gard, Jr. from the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. He's the chairman there. His policy work focuses on nuclear non-proliferation, missile defense, the war on terrorism, military policy, etc., etc. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Doing all right, Scott.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it, and I was happy to see your name on this ad in the Washington Post. Mr. President, say no to a war of choice with Iran. So I guess let's start with that. TV has it that everybody knows pretty much somewhere at some point war with Iran is necessary because they're making nukes and they're going to destroy Israel with them at their first opportunity. And so how could someone who calls himself opposed to opposed to proliferation of nuclear weapons like yourself oppose a war with Iran to prevent them from getting those nukes?
Well, because war should be a last resort. Our intelligence agencies tell us that they have no indication that Iran has made the decision to produce a nuclear weapon at this stage. And we have now imposed by far the most binding sanctions on Iran in the whole history of this sordid case. And it's clear that the Iranians are suffering as a result and have proposed reinstituting the talks. So we should try to make diplomacy work before we simply resort to the use of force, which probably would turn out to be highly counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's quite strange, it seems to me, that, as you just said, the American intelligence community's official position is that they actually haven't made a decision to begin to make nuclear weapons, and yet almost the entire discussion takes place based on the premise that they are making nuclear weapons. And, we saw this happen just not too many years ago when the vice president said that Saddam Hussein is reconstituting his nuclear weapons as though he'd ever had them in the first place. And as transparent as that was, we actually had a war based on it. And yet it's been years and years in a row, General, that anyone who's cared to actually look into it has known that really there is no secret program there, no evidence of one, and that their civilian electricity program is safeguarded by the IAEA, and that the CIA agrees with that. Our intelligence agencies agree that there's actually nothing nefarious going on here in the first place.
Well, the problem is that Iran concealed for 18 years its nuclear program until its cover was blown by that small group of Iranian dissidents that have been in Iraq for some period of time. Mm-hmm. So having that history of deception, people are concerned that they may be, in fact, concealing a program. So I can understand that concern, and that should definitely be part of the negotiations, namely that we try to get the Iranians to agree to what's called the additional protocol to allow the International Atomic Energy Agency free rein to look for any possibly concealed programs. And that should be part of the negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the news today is that the Iranians are open to allowing the UN to head to Parchin, and I guess it was just 2 weeks ago they made such big news out of that. Iran had refused, as though the IAEA was trying to go there and were blocked at the gates or something, like some scene out of Iraq in 1994 or something like that. And when that clearly wasn't the case at all, and left unmentioned in all this is that the UN's been to Parchin before and found no evidence of any nuclear work whatsoever.
Yeah, well, there's one distinction that's very important here. We have drawn the red line, we the United States, by the statement of our Secretary of Defense, that we do not want Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Now, the Israeli position is that they don't want Iran to develop the capability to produce a nuclear weapon. And that's a very important distinction because, in fact, Iran has demonstrated the capability to enrich uranium up to 20%, which is much further toward 100% than the 3.5% that you need for reactor fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Because to go from 20 to 90 is not as difficult as going from 3.5 to 20. So they probably have the capability to produce weapons-grade nuclear material. But that's not the beginning and the end of it. If we can get the IAEA in there with license to be able to check on the programs and determine that even though they have the capability to go to weapons-grade nuclear material, they're not doing it. And it isn't a matter, once you have the material, of having an explosive device. It takes further development, estimated at some 2 years by some observers. So it isn't a matter at the moment of Iran being right on the cusp of having a deliverable nuclear weapon. But the Israelis, and by Israelis I mean the government, not the population. The population of Israel favors continuation of diplomacy and does not favor a military attack because the consequences could be dire should that take place.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I want to get to that, but I think I'll probably have to save that till after the break because I want to ask you about these new negotiations that have been announced. Is this, well, I don't know if you want to comment on the politics of it, really. Maybe we'll just stick to the actual substance. Is it true, do you think, that Obama really means to negotiate this issue, or he just wants to be able to say he's exhausted all possibilities? Because so far, it seems like he's mostly just sabotaged his own pretended negotiations rather than really pursued them.
Well, he offered, you may recall, when he first came into office, he offered open dialogue with the Iranians, which essentially they rejected. Now, that was very important because the previous administration was never able to get the Chinese and the Russians to cooperate with us on putting really biting sanctions on Iran. But by President Obama demonstrating his willingness to talk, being patient, opening the channels of communication, he was able, therefore, to persuade not just the Europeans, but the Russians and the Chinese to join us in some biting sanctions. Now, that's no small accomplishment, because if sanctions are to have any effect, they have to be almost universally complied with, because if you can run around them, what's the point? But in this case, there are biting sanctions. The Iranian currencies has depreciated in value by about 50%. Prices have skyrocketed. This is having an impact. And had the president not convinced the rest of the world of the goodwill of the United States' willingness to negotiate, he would not have gotten their cooperation.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we'll have to pick it up on the other side of this break on that very point. The expanded sanctions, the crippling sanctions on Iran, and the possibility of war and what that might look like with Lieutenant General Robert Gard from the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. That's armscontrolcenter.org. We'll be right back. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Lieutenant General Robert Gard, retired, from armscontrolcenter.org. That's the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. We're talking about Iran and the threat of war and sanctions and negotiations, and actually that's where we left off, sir, was the question of whether these new negotiations, I guess, that have just started, are actually going to be productive. And you say that because they have Russia and China, are they to participate in the negotiations themselves? And then also you're saying, I believe you were saying before the break, that the sanctions make the success of the negotiations more likely, perhaps, rather than less, which I guess would surprise me, but I'd be happy to hear your explanation why you think so.
Well, if we can believe the National Intelligence Estimate, the one in 2007 that has been criticized, to me the most significant finding was that the Iranians operate on a cost-benefit analysis basis. Not that they are a bunch of wild fanatics interested in committing suicide.
Right.
Now, the sanctions are applied to try to penalize them for failing to cooperate with the IAEA. The IAEA is in Iran, the International Atomic Energy Agency, but they are not given as free rein as they would if Iran would ratify the additional protocol that would allow the IAEA to look for possibilities of secret programs rather than simply inspecting declared facilities, which is what's in the basic charter. Now, right now, Iran clearly is hurting. This should cause them to see if there's some way that they can get relief from the difficulties that they're currently facing. So our whole objective in the sanctions is not to punish them just for the sake of punishment. It's to bring them to the conference table to see if we can get a resolution to this concern about their developing nuclear weapons. In the previous administration, the sanctions were not biting because they didn't have the cooperation of Russia and China, and indeed some European nations. Now we do have that cooperation, and so the Iranians have a higher motivation now for trying to obtain some relief. So I think that does help achieve the objective we're after, which is to get them to the negotiation tables and to be able to create a situation in which, should they decide to produce a weapon, we'll have plenty of notice because the IAEA will be there, and Iran will have to eject the IAEA if they're going to proceed on to the development of a weapon. So, will these negotiations...
Isn't that the current situation, though? I mean, how's that different? They continue to verify the non-diversion of declared nuclear material on a every few monthly basis, and they would have to withdraw from the NPT and kick the inspectors out, turn the cameras and sensors off in order to begin pursuing nuclear weapons as of years ago, right?
Not unless they have some other secret facilities that they have not declared, and we don't know.
Yeah. And you think that I guess I'm confused because it seemed to me like the nuclear issue is really all smokescreen anyway. They don't really believe the, State Department or whatever. They don't believe that if they had an additional protocol that then the IAEA would go out and stumble across a secret nuclear weapons program somewhere in Iran, right? This is just they want to have something to say the Iranians aren't doing.
Well, the additional protocol does allow very liberal seek and search by the IAEA. Now, they're just not going to run around the country based on no information, but if they are there and they are consulting with Iranian scientists and all the rest, if something is going on, the likelihood of their getting tipped off is much higher.
Yeah. Well,
and so we don't lose anything, and we may gain a lot.
But then again, I mean, El Baradei, the former director of the IAEA, used to always say there's no indication, no evidence and no indication of a nuclear weapons program. And as you said, the NIE back in 2007 and the official position of the intelligence community this whole time is that they have not made the decision to begin making nukes. In other words, the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command, as Seymour Hersh reported, they're on the ground there in his article, 6 months ago or whatever. They don't believe that there's a secret nuclear weapons program there to find. The American intelligence community. In fact, the Israelis just said the same thing, and at least to Haaretz, if not on TV, a couple of weeks ago.
Well, this facility at Qom, they were building that secretly. We discovered it, and then they quickly announced it before we did. But that was a secret facility that was the construction of which was underway for some time, and it's much better protected in the mountainside than the one at Natanz. So nobody can be certain that there are not other facilities. Yes, the IAEA is there, and so far, I believe, has been able to keep track of the uranium enrichment that is underway. There is enough at the 3.5 level for at least 4 nuclear weapons, should they continue enrichment up to weapons grade. They are enriching up to 20%, ostensibly for their medical reactor, but they now have more uranium enriched to 20% than they can use in something like 8 years in their medical reactor, and they're continuing to enrich it. So everything is not crystal clear. We should be prudent. The president just took a very hard line on this issue, I think basically in response to some very irresponsible almost warmongering by the part of the Republican candidates for president that are trying to make President Obama look feckless, as the term is used, and weak.
Well, now, General, let me ask you, I mean, it does say here in this ad that you guys all wrote in the Post is from the National Iranian American Council, and you have Tom Fingar, the former head of the National Intelligence Council from 2007 there, and Colonel Larry Wilkerson and Paul Pillar and others who signed on to this letter. But you do say in here, preventing a nuclear-armed Iran is rightfully your priority and your red line. So I wonder, does that mean that y'all's consensus would be you would support Obama in a war against Iran if they did break out and begin to make nuclear weapons?
If the president should choose to go to war, and I think he would do so only under the most extreme circumstances, given the history of Iraq and Afghanistan. But
you're not endorsing containment here. If they did break out and start making nukes, you wouldn't say, well, contain them like the Russians and Chinese. You would say, go ahead and start a war before they can finish putting a nuke together?
I would not take that position, no.
Okay. Because, yeah, I think, well, I mean, it's pretty standard fare, don't get me wrong, but, it's actually not up to the president to decide to start a war in America's system, supposedly anyway, although it's been a while since since Korea, presidents have decided on their own. Anyway, I just wonder whether that's a legitimate red line at all, and I'm sorry, we kind of really don't have time to discuss this. I guess we can go a little bit over time here, but as much as, you're from the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, and I'm certainly for non-proliferation too, in the Vegas sense anyway, I want no nuclear weapons in the whole world if that's possible. But on the other hand, if Iran had an arsenal of, I don't know, a dozen or 2 dozen nukes like the Chinese have, I'm not sure why that would be any more alarming than the Chinese having them, or why we would ever need to start a war over something like that, and especially when we're threatening them every day. No wonder they even would consider trying to build nukes.
Well, we I think have put them under sufficient threat so that it gives them an incentive to develop the weapons for deterrent purposes. But I basically,
in the name of deterring them from doing so.
Yeah. And, however, a major concern is that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, that could start a cascade, beginning with Saudi Arabia and other countries, and you're likely to find the very proliferation that we are trying to prevent. And if we can stop Iran from developing a weapon, it'd be very much in our interest.
All right. Well, thanks for staying over with us, especially here. Sorry to keep you long. Everybody, that's Lieutenant General Robert Gard from the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. That's armscontrolcenter.org. Thanks very much for your time. Appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity to participate.
All right, y'all. We'll be right back.